Bikers mock veteran in a wheelchair, but his response will blow your mind. Oh, it was a chilly Saturday afternoon, and the quiet town was wrapped in the cool embrace of a late fall mist. The streets, usually bustling with the sounds of conversation and the occasional car engine, were now almost still, as though the whole world was waiting for something. The diner, an old fixture of the town with its flickering neon lights and checkered floors, had become a refuge for the few locals brave enough to venture out in the cold. But on this particular afternoon, something was about to disrupt the calm. The usual hum of the diner's neon lights, accompanied by the soft chime of the doorbell as people entered and left, was abruptly interrupted by the roar of motorcycles. The sound, deep and powerful, reverberated through the streets like thunder, announcing the arrival of a group of bikers who had just pulled into the parking lot. Their bikes, polished and gleaming under the pale light of the afternoon, stood in stark contrast to the muted tones of the town around them. The group, a mix of men and women in their late 30s and early 40s, was led by a man who seemed to dominate every inch of space he occupied. His name was Big Joe, a burly figure whose reputation for intimidation had preceded him wherever he went. Big Joe had earned his name over the years by terrorizing not just the streets, but also the businesses in town. He was known for his brute strength, his disdain for rules, and his ability to get what he wanted by sheer force. He had made enemies, but he had also made friends. Friends who feared him and respected his power. As his gang dismounted, laughter erupted from their group, rough and hearty, filling the air with the sound of their bravado. The other bikers, each with their own stories etched in the lines of their weathered faces, strutted into the diner with the confidence of people who were used to being feared. Their leather jackets were adorned with patches and emblems that spoke of years on the road, symbols of places they had been, fights they had won, and lives they had left behind. The owner of the diner, an old friend of the gang, greeted them with a forced smile, knowing it was only a matter of time before trouble found its way to the front door. "Good day," said the owner, his voice carrying a crescent tone that made the others want to be kind to the intruder. But today, there was something different about the atmosphere in the diner. The usual clinking of plates and the chatter of regulars seemed to fall away, replaced by an unspoken tension in the air. As the bikers ordered their food and began to regale each other with stories of their most recent exploits, something lingered, a quiet unease that no one could quite place. At a table in the far corner of the diner, near the large windows that overlooked the misty street, sat an older man. His face was weathered, deeply lined by years of hardship, and his eyes, sharp yet tired, held the weight of 1,000 stories. He was alone, sitting quietly in a wheelchair. His name was Henry Carter, but around these parts he was known simply as the Vet. He had spent the better part of his life serving his country, his youth stolen by the horrors of war, and his later years marked by the scars, both visible and invisible, of what he had endured. For years he had avoided the company of others, choosing instead to live in isolation, tucked away in his small home on the edge of town. But something today had brought him out of his solitude. Maybe it was the need to feel the pulse of life again, even if just for a few moments. He hadn't been to the diner in years, not since he had returned from the war. The memories were still too raw, the faces of lost comrades still too fresh in his mind. But today, he had felt the need to be around people again, even if only as a silent observer. The bikers, caught up in their own world, didn't notice Henry at first. They were too consumed with their loud conversation, ordering their food and swapping stories that often bordered on the edge of decency. Henry sat still, his hands resting on the armrests of his chair, his posture straight despite the years that weighed on him. He watched them quietly, but there was no fear in his gaze. He had seen far worse in his lifetime, had experienced battles no one in this room could ever truly understand. Then, as if drawn by some instinct, Big Joe turned around. "Shook up!" His eyes fell on Henry, taking in the older man's wheelchair, the quiet dignity that surrounded him. A cruel smile twisted across Big Joe's face as he took a few steps toward Henry, his heavy boots making a dull thud against the diner's wooden floor. "Well, well, well." Big Joe's voice was rough and mocking as he stopped beside Henry's table. "What do we have here? A vet hiding away in a chair?" His tone dripped with sarcasm, and the bikers, sensing an opportunity for entertainment, gathered behind him. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. He wasn't just addressing Henry, he was asserting his dominance over the whole room, daring anyone to challenge him. Henry didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Big Joe, unwavering. There was no fear, no sign of submission, only a quiet resolve that seemed to radiate from him, filling the space between them. Big Joe leaned in closer, his breath hot and heavy with the smell of whiskey and tobacco. "You should be somewhere far away, where people don't care about your past," he sneered. "This is a place for real men, not rich men who sit around waiting for life to pass them by." The laughter from the other bikers rippled through the room, but Henry didn't react. He simply looked at Big Joe with a calmness that unnerved him. Henry's voice, when it came, was soft but steady, like the calm before a storm. "You think this chair defines me?" Henry asked, his voice low but resolute. "It doesn't. It's not the chair that makes the man. It's the strength of his spirit, the courage in his heart, the ability to stand tall no matter how many times life tries to knock him down." For a moment the diner fell silent. The clinking of silverware, the hum of the jukebox, all of it seemed to stop. The air was thick with the weight of Henry's words, and even the bikers, hardened by years of living on the edge, felt the gravity of the moment. Big Joe, usually quick with a retort, stood frozen. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected a challenge like this from an old man in a wheelchair. For a long moment, there was nothing but the quiet tension between them. Big Joe's smirk faltered as he tried to process Henry's words, but before he could speak, Henry pushed himself forward. With a deep, steadying breath, Henry gripped the arms of his chair. His muscles trembled with the effort, but he didn't waver. Slowly he shifted his weight, using the strength of his arms to lift himself up, inch by inch, until his feet finally touched the ground. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't easy, but in that moment the room seemed to hold its breath. The bikers, Big Joe included, stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with disbelief. Henry stood tall, not just in stature, but in spirit. His eyes met Big Joe's, and though the younger man towered over him, there was something undeniable in Henry's gaze. A quiet power, a force that demanded respect. "I'm not a has-been," Henry said, his voice ringing clear across the diner. "I've fought for more than your petty little games. I've fought for freedom, for honor, for the lives of my brothers who didn't make it home. And you know what? I'm still standing. No matter what life throws at me, I'm still here." Big Joe's bravado faltered, his usual smirk turning into something unreadable. He was a man who had built his reputation on fear, but here, in front of this quiet, weathered old soldier, he felt a shift, a sense of his own fragility. Henry's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Big Joe didn't know how to respond. His mind scrambled for something, anything, to counter Henry's calm defiance, but nothing came. His usual taunts, the quick jabs that had always put people in their place, seemed to evaporate in the face of the veteran's unyielding strength. Henry's chest rose and fell with the effort it had taken to rise, but his voice never faltered. "You may be big, you may be tough, but it's not the size of the man that matters. It's the size of his heart, his will to keep going when everyone else gives up." And with that, Henry slowly lowered himself back into his chair. The tension in the room remained, but something had changed. The bikers, once full of bravado, now stood in silence. Even Big Joe, towering over the rest, couldn't find the words to speak. His head dropped slightly, his usual sneer replaced with a contemplative frown. Henry sat in silence for a few moments, his hands resting on the arms of his chair. He had won something today, though he hadn't come here for a victory. No, today he had reminded them all that true strength wasn't measured by muscles or fear. It was measured by the ability to keep standing when everything else seemed to want to push you down. The moments stretched on, and one by one the bikers began to file out of the diner. Big Joe lingered for a moment, his eyes flicking over to Henry one last time. But instead of the usual mockery, there was a flicker of something like respect in his gaze. Slowly, he turned, joining his gang as they walked out into the cold afternoon air. As the door swung closed behind them, the diner seemed to exhale. The hum of the jukebox resumed, soft and steady, and the clink of silverware returned. But the air had shifted. In the quiet aftermath, Henry Carter, the man known simply as the Vet, sat alone, but not lonely. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. Hope not just for himself, but for the people around him. The diner was quiet, but to Henry, it had never felt more alive. The air in the diner was thick with an unsettling silence, a stillness that felt like the calm before a storm. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the weight of the moment settling heavily over everyone present. Big Joe, the leader of the biker gang, stood motionless, his large, imposing frame frozen in a way that suggested his confidence had been shaken. Perhaps for the first time in years, his face, once twisted with arrogance and disdain, now wore a mask of disbelief, as though the very ground beneath him had been ripped away. A flicker of grudging respect crossed his features, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by uncertainty. For all the power he had wielded over the years, here he was, facing down a man who had risen from the depths of struggle with a strength that was beyond his comprehension. The other bikers, who had been swaggering moments earlier, full of their usual bravado and loud talk, exchanged glances. Their cocky smiles had faded into uneasy expressions. There was no denying it. Henry's sudden rise had shifted the energy in the room, disrupting the hierarchy they had taken for granted. They had underestimated the old man, and now they were starting to feel the consequences of their miscalculation. Big Joe was the first to break the silence, but his voice was different now, sharper, more cautious, laced with something Henry hadn't expected. Doubt. "You should have stayed seated, old man," Joe muttered, his words quieter than they had been before. They still carried an edge, but there was no longer the same cruel certainty in his tone. It was as though the very act of Henry standing up had done more than just challenge him physically. It had shaken him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Joe stepped back, wiping his hands on the leather of his jacket, his eyes not quite meeting Henry's. His posture was no longer the towering presence it had once been. The old man had done something to him, something that made him question his own strength. Henry's chest still heaved from the effort of rising from his chair, the physical strain evident, but his voice remained steady, unwavering. There was no fear in it, no anger, just the calm confidence of someone who had been through too much to back down now. "You think standing up is easy?" Henry's words were measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of his years. "It never is. But sometimes it's the only thing that shows we're not broken. We're not done, and that's what matters." His eyes, though tired, held a fire that wasn't easily extinguished. His words were simple, but they carried a truth that cut through the room like a blade. Standing up wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving it to yourself. The diners, who had been sitting in stunned silence, now began to stir. The room was filled with low murmurs, whispers that rose and fell like the tide. They had been hesitant to get involved, unsure of which side to take, but now they couldn't ignore what had just transpired. Henry's defiance had transcended the moment. It had become something more. It had become a symbol of quiet resistance. People didn't just see an old man in a wheelchair anymore. They saw someone who had found a way to rise against the odds. They saw someone who had stood up for something greater than himself. Then, from the far side of the diner, a voice broke through the murmur of the crowd. The man in the corner, a quiet observer until now, stood up. His presence was commanding in a way that didn't require loud words or grand gestures. He was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with a long coat that draped over his shoulders and a weathered face that spoke of a life lived fully. One, filled with challenges, but also with wisdom. His steps were deliberate, his gait steady, as he made his way toward Henry's table. He wasn't tall or muscular, but there was something about him that demanded attention. It wasn't forceful, it was earned. He walked with the quiet assurance of someone who had seen the worst of the world and had come out the other side intact. "I think you've underestimated this man, Joe," the older man said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of experience and authority. His words were not a challenge, they were a simple statement of truth. Big Joe's eyes flicked toward the stranger, confusion momentarily crossing his features. He hadn't expected anyone to step into this confrontation, least of all a man like this, whose presence didn't scream aggression, but commanded respect nonetheless. "And who the hell are you?" Joe growled, his voice still low and threatening. The words were an attempt to regain some semblance of control, but they faltered as soon as they left his mouth. He wasn't sure what to make of this man, and the uncertainty was more unsettling than any threat. "I'm someone who's seen men like you try to tear down people like him," the older man said, his voice steady, but carrying an undeniable strength. "I've seen your kind before, men who think their fists and fear can break anyone, that they can bully others into submission. But Henry, he's not someone you break. He's someone you respect." The words echoed through the diner, resonating with a quiet power that made everyone sit up straighter. It wasn't just a defense of Henry, it was a condemnation of the very system of power that Joe had so long taken for granted. The room grew even quieter as the stranger's words took root in the hearts of those listening. Joe's bravado, which had once been as loud as the roar of his motorcycle, faltered in the face of this unspoken truth. The other bikers, once so sure of themselves, looked around at each other in growing discomfort. The authority they had once held over the room was slipping away, and no one knew how to regain it. Joe looked around at his gang, seeking their support, but none came. There were no nods, no affirmations of his dominance. His gang, who had once been eager to follow his lead without question, now seemed uncertain, even hesitant. The silence grew heavier, and Joe's anger, though still present, no longer had the same bite. It was a shadow of what it had been. His posture slumped slightly as he turned his back on Henry and the stranger, not willing to admit defeat, but unable to do anything else. "I don't need to be lectured by you or him," Joe muttered, his words still defiant, but lacking the conviction they had once carried. He grumbled under his breath, his back turned to the two men who had brought the storm crashing down upon him. But his voice was no longer threatening. It was resigned. Henry, still standing, didn't move. He didn't need to. He had already said what needed to be said. His chest still heaved with the effort of standing, but his heart was steady. "Sometimes, it's not about proving anything to anyone else," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's about proving it to yourself. You do what you have to, and I'll do what I have to." The room was thick with a quiet tension. Big Joe's defiance had faded, replaced with the uncomfortable weight of realization. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the diner on him, no longer in fear, but in judgment. The power he had once commanded had dissipated like smoke in the air. The lesson Henry had taught wasn't just about strength, it was about respect. And Joe, for all his bravado, had never truly earned it. The older man, who had come to Henry's defense, stepped forward once more. His voice was final, carrying the weight of someone who had been through the fire and had emerged stronger for it. "Come on, boys," he said with a glance at Joe. "You've had your fun. Maybe it's time to take your ride elsewhere. These people are tired of the noise." The command in his voice brooked no argument. Joe, his head hung low in reluctant acknowledgement of his loss of power, let out a grunt and turned toward the door. One by one, the bikers followed, their steps heavy and subdued, no longer the loud, imposing figures they had once been. They didn't make eye contact with Henry, their heads lowered as if in silent defeat. The diner returned to its peaceful rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed. The weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air like a soft hum, a reminder that things could, and had, shifted. As the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance, Henry slowly made his way back to his wheelchair. His hands trembled slightly from the exertion, but there was a quiet smile of victory on his lips. The victory wasn't in the fact that he had faced down Joe and his gang. It wasn't even in the fact that he had stood up physically. It was in something much more profound. The quiet triumph of spirit, of dignity, of respect. The man who had come to Henry's aid gave him a knowing nod. "You don't need to prove yourself to anyone," he said. "But today, you showed them what real strength looks like." Henry settled back into his chair, nodding in agreement. His voice was soft but resolute. "Strength isn't in the muscles, it's in what you choose to stand for, and today, I chose to stand for respect." He glanced out the window, his eyes following the distant echo of motorcycles as they disappeared into the horizon. The empty parking lot outside was quiet again, but the sound of it spoke volumes. Henry had stood for something greater than himself that day, and though the world outside would continue as it always had, for a brief moment the balance of power had shifted. It had been a victory nonetheless.